Okay, let's dive into this. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to unpack the hidden magic of light and color. We're going to completely decode the subconscious psychological tools that filmmakers use every single day to manipulate our emotions. By the end of this, you're going to see exactly how professionals design the imagery that keeps us all totally glued to the screen.
But first, think about this for a second. Would you be able to sleep in a bright red room? Probably not, right? You'd be tossing and turning all night, feeling just completely wired. And this simple, kind of visceral question points out a foundational truth of filmmaking. Colors instantly elicit emotions. They have a direct, undeniable psychological effect on us. So before we reveal the actual magician's secrets, the highly technical tools cinematographers use on set, we really have to establish this baseline. Color is the ultimate emotional shortcut.
Section 1. The Psychology of Color.
Okay, so every single color you see on screen can basically be broken down into just three factors. It's known as HSB. First, hue, which is just the actual color itself. Next, saturation, that's the intensity of the color. And finally, brightness, literally just how light or dark that color is. And here's the thing, by manipulating just these three basic dials, filmmakers can create incredibly complex moods. For example, they might use a post-production process called a bleach bypass to drastically lower the saturation. This literally drains the color right out of the image, which instantly gives, say, a historical period piece a really cold, gritty, and raw look. Or, on the flip side of that, they can pump up the brightness and saturation to mimic the lively, super vivid excitement of those classical Technicolor films.
And speaking of hue, sometimes the film will use what's called an affinity of hue, meaning they stick mostly to just one specific color. Think about The Matrix and that iconic line, "Welcome to the desert of the real." Well, that entire film utilizes a monochromatic, sickly green hue almost everywhere. And why is that? It's because we naturally associate the color green with computer code. That single hue is visually communicating to our subconscious that these characters are trapped inside a digital simulation. It's brilliant.
Section 2. The Kelvin Scale Paradox.
Now, moving into the actual science of light. Back in the early 1900s, a German physicist named Max Planck devised a formula to measure the exact color temperature of theoretical light sources, and these temperatures are measured in a unit called kelvins. But here is the massive paradox. In our everyday lives, we naturally associate the color orange with feeling warm and the color blue with feeling cool, right? But in the physics of light, it's actually the exact opposite. A physically hotter temperature actually produces a cooler, more blue light. Meanwhile, a cooler physical temperature produces a warmer, more orange light. I know, it is totally counterintuitive, but it's literally the absolute bedrock of cinematic lighting.
Let's quickly map out some standard color temperatures that you actually encounter every single day. So, a flickering candle flame, that's burning very cool on this physics scale, sitting at around 1900 Kelvin, which gives us that rich orange glow. Now, your typical incandescent indoor bulb, or say the golden hour right before sunset, that sits right around 3200 Kelvin. Once we step outside into clear midday daylight, we jump up to about 5600 Kelvin, which appears essentially white to our eyes. And if the weather turns, an overcast sky pushes the temperature even higher, up to 6500 Kelvin or more, which introduces a heavy, heavy amount of blue.
Section 3. Hacking your white balance.
But, understanding those color temperatures, that's really only the first step. The real secret here lies in manipulating how the camera itself interprets that light. Enter white balance. This is simply a setting that tells the digital camera what specific temperature it should actually register as true white. Usually pros will set this using a gray or a white card on set. And here is where the magic trick happens. Once you lock in that baseline true white, any light source in your scene with a higher Kelvin rating than your setting will appear cooler and bluer, and any light source with a lower Kelvin rating is going to appear warmer and more orange. You are essentially shifting the entire reality of the camera's eye.
Now sure, most modern cameras have an automatic feature for this, but auto white balance is a setting that should honestly almost never be trusted by professionals. Think about it. If you're shooting a scene and the lighting organically changes, the camera's going to try to magically adjust mid-shot, totally ruining your visual consistency. Or, say your actor walks in front of a giant green wall. The auto white balance might pick up that green reflection and try to mathematically compensate for it, and suddenly your perfectly lit skin tones are an absolute unusable mess.
So instead of trusting the camera, professionals aggressively lock it in themselves. Take the number 4400, for example. The director of photography for the show Ozark locked their camera's white balance to exactly 4400 Kelvin for the entire production. Every single interior, every exterior, day or night. And by committing to this one specific number, they ensured a consistently dark, cooler, grayish-bluish palette across the whole series. It was a purely mathematical decision that perfectly accented the incredibly dark subject matter of that show.
Section 4. Recreate, modify, exaggerate.
So the crucial point is, lighting for cinema isn't just, turning on a lamp in a room. Cinematographer Rob Ellis explains that cinema relies heavily on borrowing a piece of reality to create our very own, and he uses this fantastic three-step framework for designing a scene's lighting. Recreate, modify, exaggerate. This is essentially the core formula for visual storytelling.
Okay, step 1. Recreate nature. Let's say you want to fake a highly realistic sunset inside a room. You wouldn't just blast one single light at the window. No, you would set a bright 3200 Kelvin light outside acting as the sun itself. Then, you'd bounce another 3200 Kelvin light outside to mimic the warm evening sky, sort of wrapping around the house. And then, inside the room, you'd bounce a slightly cooler 4200 Kelvin light off a wall to mimic the natural ambient light reflecting around the interior space. That setup right there gives you pure, untouched reality.
But pure reality isn't always what the story actually needs, right? So step 2 is modify for mood. What if you take that indoor ambient bounce light from our sunset setup and mathematically tweak it to a massive, super cool 20,000 Kelvin? Well, suddenly you've introduced this deep, unnatural blue shadow to the room. Subconsciously, this pulls the audience into a much darker, more melancholy emotion, even though that warm sun outside the window hasn't changed at all.
And then we have step 3, exaggerate. In absolute reality, moonlight is just a reflection of the sun bouncing off a giant rock in space sitting at roughly 4,000 Kelvin. It's essentially a dim, colorless gray. But because our human eyes shift to different light receptor cells in the dark, cells that heavily pick up the blue end of the spectrum, we actually perceive moonlight as blue. So in cinema, filmmakers deliberately exaggerate this movie magic. They'll blast harsh 6,500 Kelvin lights to create this deep, rich blue moonlight. And then they contrast that with super warm 2,700 Kelvin indoor household lamps. Now in the real world, you rarely see those two extreme lights together. But in cinema, that exaggeration is precisely what feels real to our emotions.
Section 5. Breaking the color rules.
Now, before the digital age, and honestly still heavily utilized today, filmmakers manipulate light using gels. These are just transparent materials placed directly over physical lights. CTB stands for color temperature blue, and CTO is color temperature orange. Take the indie movie A Ghost Story. The main location is just a single house that sees a lot of different occupants over vast amounts of time, and the cinematographer beautifully marked these massive time jumps just by hacking the color temperatures on practical sets, specifically using gels on a single kitchen light. He used a half-pink gel for one family, a CTB blue gel for another, and a CTO orange gel for the final couple. It is an absolute masterclass in using light temperature to drive the story forward without saying a single word.
And this brilliantly illustrates how mixing color temperatures creates real, visceral, physical sensations. Take a look at The Hangover Part 2. The characters wake up in a grimy hotel room in Bangkok. The cinematographer there purposefully mixed a warm 3200 Kelvin tungsten bulb with an uncorrected fluorescent light that had this nasty green spike to it. When you mathematically mix that cool daylight with uncorrected green, you get this sickening, unnatural cyan hue. And when you combine that with the warm tungsten bulb, it instantly communicates a sweaty, gross, and intensely hot physical environment. You literally feel the humidity and heat just by looking at the color mixing. It's crazy.
Or look at the movie Palm Springs, where the color orange is deeply tied to the narrative love story. The cinematographer rigged a brilliant in-camera lighting trick during a really pivotal bar scene. At the exact moment the main character, Niles, realizes he is in love with Sarah, the background lights physically dim, and the light on her face shifts from a neutral white to a deep reddish orange. It's a literal, physical manifestation of his changing emotions, happening right in front of the lens in real time.
So what does this all mean? The ultimate takeaway here is that context is everything. You make the rules. I mean, violent red usually means blood and danger, right? But director Spike Jonze heavily used saturated red in the film Her to constantly represent love and connection. Black is practically universally reserved for the bad guys, unless of course the movie is Batman, where the hero lives in the shadows. The point is, color, temperature, and hue only mean what the filmmaker trains you to think they mean within the strict context of that specific story. As the cinematographer, you are the architect of the emotion.
So next time you sit down to watch a movie, I want you to stop and ask yourself, how is the lighting manipulating my emotions right now? Look for those deep blue 6500 Kelvin exaggerated moonlights, the sickly green monochromatic matrix hues, or those warm 3200 Kelvin incandescent glows. Look for where they purposely mix warm and cool light to make you feel uneasy. Once you learn this technical language of color temperature and white balance, you will absolutely never look at a film the same way again. Thanks for diving into this explainer with me, and keep an eye on the light.